All right, so we are continuing. We're going to finish Mark chapter 6 this morning. The last time that we were in Mark, we had just finished up to verse 29, 30, and we're going to finish that. And verse 30, which I've read several times, it says, "The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught." Now, like I've mentioned before, just to refresh your memory, at the beginning of Mark chapter 6, Jesus sent his disciples out on their very first mission, and now they've finally returned from that mission. And upon seeing Jesus again, they tell him everything that they did, the things that happened, the things that they taught, because they went out in the power and authority of Jesus. They had a very fruitful mission while they were gone. And notice the very first thing Jesus says to them as they've returned. Verses 31 through 32, Jesus says, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves." Now, Mark does not tell us how long the disciples were gone on their mission. Some of the best guesses range all the way up to maybe they were gone for about 6 months. But we can't be certain. Since they traveled on foot, they were gone at least a few months. Because of what they did and how they would have traveled and everything like that. But when they return, the first thing Jesus says is get away and get some rest. It's the first thing he says to them. Now, this story in Mark, it's one of the only stories that is in all 4 Gospels. However, it is John's Gospel where we get way more information about what happened after this event than the other Gospels give us. And we know from when we look at all the accounts from Matthew and Luke and John as well, that what he said to them, what he says to them in the other accounts is, "Come away with me. Let's go away together," basically, because time alone with Jesus is the sustenance of the Christian life. If you do not prioritize spending time with Jesus, reading his word, praying, waiting on him, meditating on him, without distraction, if we don't do that, we will never be capable of accomplishing much for him. If we don't have that time alone with him to be filled and regenerized, that Jesus often went away with the Father after he did something. He would get away by himself because that's where the power comes from. And the disciples came back. They were spent. They were empty. They weren't even able to really eat much food. And they needed to be refilled physically and, most importantly, spiritually. However, their long-awaited time back with Jesus was going to have to wait. Because in verse 33, it says, "Now many saw them going and recognized them. And they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them." Now, it's easy to just read over that verse and keep going, but there's something interesting going on here. Because if you go to the end of the story, it tells us that there were 5,000 men in this crowd. Just the men. So you got to think, how many of them were single? How many of them had their wives? How many of them had family members? How many of them had children? When you really look at how much total, you're looking at anywhere between probably 5,000 to 15,000 people total. If there's just 5,000 men, there could have been easily double that amount total. So you have this massive crowd that sees Jesus and his disciples, and they run ahead to get there before them. Now, did all 5 or more thousand people, did they all run to get there at once? There could have been a lot of people already there, but there's a gargantuan amount of people chasing after Jesus to get where he is, okay? Now, we got to ask the question, why? Why was there that many people running after Jesus? And an immediate response is, oh, well, they heard of him. He was there. They wanted to go to him. They wanted to meet him. And that might be true, but there's more to that, especially when we go to John's gospel and we look at the area. There's more to it. There are political motivations in this crowd. This area where Jesus and the disciples was a hot spot for sentiments of political revolution and uprising. A couple weeks ago, I talked about Herod the Tetrarch, a wonderful man. Him and his brothers took over control of Jerusalem from their father, Herod the Great, who was the leader of Jerusalem when Jesus was born. So Herod the Great dies, and his 4 sons each take a quarter of the kingdom of Jerusalem. But after Herod the Great died, there was a revolt that tried to prevent his sons from taking over Jerusalem after him. There was a big revolt. They didn't succeed. And then after that, there was a movement by a group called the Zealots that wanted to rebel against the Roman Empire after that. And you hear about that in Acts 5:37, when the religious leaders are talking about how to deal with Jesus, and they're talking about all the other people before Jesus that raised a bunch of hoopla. And it says in Acts 5:37, after him is Judas the Galilean, who rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. Judas the Galilean was the leader and the founder of this zealot movement that tried to overthrow the Roman Empire. And so they're in this area where there's just these ideas of political uprising and revolution and everything like that. And that's the context of these people running after Jesus. Well, what is their goal? What are they wanting to accomplish? Well, in John's account of this story, after Jesus feeds the crowd with the bread and the fish, in John 6:15, it says, Jesus, perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So he immediately withdraws because he can see their hearts, he can read their minds, and he knows they're about to grab him and try to force him to be their king of this new revolution that they're trying to start against the Roman Empire. And Jesus is having none of it. He refuses to make his mission political. Because remember, they thought the Messiah was basically going to be a political Messiah. They thought he was going to come, get rid of the Roman Empire, establish Israel as the head of the whole area, and they thought it was going to be a very physical, political uprising. And Jesus doesn't let them get. And then if you read on in John 6 to more of Jesus' interaction, he really begins to scold them for how they're thinking, and he refuses to give in to any of their thoughts, and he just says, no, this is how you have to think, and this is what he tells them the truth. And I tell you, that's very relevant right now in our country, because obviously, I think today is Charlie Kirk's funeral, and obviously, if you've been on social media after his assassination, you see everything going on. And one of the things happening that we need to be careful of, and as I mentioned this last week, is what you see now is the conservatives on the right are like, okay, the left is the enemy. Get rid of the left. Shut them up. Don't let them talk. Don't let them spread their ideas. And they're making this a political fight. And many Christians are getting dragged into it. And I'm seeing Christians I know that are like, yes, down with the left. And they're making it political. This is not political. This is spiritual. I mean, what do you think is behind the evil that's causing people to be killed? It's Satan and sin that's behind it. And the people, the crowd that Jesus is interacting with, they're trying to make everything political. And Jesus is saying, no, this is not political. This is spiritual. He refuses to give him an inch. And we need to learn from that. We cannot let ourselves get distracted, because when we start making things political, what will inevitably happen is you begin to look at people as the enemy. People are not the enemy. We wrestle not with flesh and blood. People are lost in sin, and they need the gospel. No matter right, left, no matter how evil, no matter how bad things they talk about, they need the gospel, they need the love of Jesus, and they need us to present that to them. And so I just love that these people, they try to force Jesus to be a political king, and he says, nope, I am not going to be political. This is spiritual. And so in verse 34, it says, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Even in their error, Jesus still had compassion. He knew they are confused, they're lost, and what they need is they need correct truth about what really matters. Because remember, they had a very wrong idea of the Messiah, and so Jesus immediately decides they need to know the truth. They need to learn the truth of God's plans and God's purposes. And I believe it's either Luke or John that does mention Jesus healing people as well. But Mark does not mention that. But we need to realize miracles don't accomplish much without correct understanding of who Jesus is and what he wants. You can't have, there's churches that they just want the miracles, they want the experiences, and there's very little teaching, very little truth, and that's a dangerous thing. The truth of God is got to be central, and Jesus, that's what he's doing with this crowd. They need to be taught. They need the truth, and so he is compassionately giving it to them. I mean, what did Jesus tell the disciples before he just ascended to heaven at the end of Matthew? What did he tell them to do? Baptize and teach. Those are the two things he told the disciples to do before he ascended to heaven. Now, as we go through the rest of this story, we're going to learn some very important lessons from both the disciples. You have two character groups here. You have the disciples, and then you have the crowd who's being taught and fed by Jesus. And we're going to learn some very important lessons from both of those groups. So let's look at the disciples first. So Jesus is teaching this massive crowd of people, right? And while the disciples are on stand, they're just standing by, okay? Now, it's easy for us, looking back 2,000 years later, to realize that Jesus always knows exactly what to do, and he knows what's best in every situation, and we need to just leave him alone and let him do what he wants to do. We understand that. Even though we don't always obey that, we cognitively understand that, right? We fully understand the reality of God's omniscience, or the fact that God is all-knowing. This is one of the important truths of Scripture. This is one of the most classic beliefs that the church has always held for 2,000 years, that God knows everything that there can be to be known. Basically, an easy way to understand it is God is incapable of learning. He's incapable of learning because he knows everything that could ever possibly happen. And there is one of the heresies that is in the church today, and I don't use that word lightly, the H word, heresy. I reserve it for things that are actually heretical. One of the heresies in the church is something called process theology. And what this is, it's the belief that God doesn't know everything. And in fact, not only does God have to learn, but God changes. He learns and he changes and he adapts. And that sounds a lot like a human, doesn't it? That's what happens when you want to make God in your own image. Is you say, no, God learns. And interestingly enough, there was a pretty kind of somewhat famous professor in the denomination named Thomas Ord, who was or elder and professor for many years. He began teaching this stuff. He wrote books about it. And our manual almost has a loophole to where he could technically get away with that, which that shouldn't matter because it's against the main manual, which is the Bible. But yeah, and then he began, and what's interesting is you find this pattern. He then began to embrace and affirm homosexuality and transgenderism. It's interesting how heresies always seem to lead to more and more heresy. But fortunately, thankfully, the leaders of our denomination sat down, talked to him, asked him, do you believe this? He said yes, and they removed his membership, removed his eldership, and he's no longer in the denomination, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing to know that our denomination did not put up with that kind of heresy. But anyway, but you know, and just so you know, God knows everything. We know that. But the disciples should have known that, right? They should have sat back and let Jesus do whatever he was going to do with no questions asked. But if you've read enough of the Gospels, you know that many times the disciples did not fully understand what Jesus was doing. A lot of times didn't understand what he said. They didn't get it, the things he was doing. They believed it was the Messiah, but many times they didn't get it. They didn't understand him. And so, as he's teaching, they come up, and in verse 35, it says, when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowd away into the surrounding countryside and villages and to buy themselves something to eat. The first thing we can see here is that while Jesus was focusing on the things that were spiritual, the disciples were focusing on the physical. Their mind was on the physical instead of where Jesus' mind was, which was on the spiritual. The disciples are focusing on the physical. As Jesus is teaching, they keep checking their watches. It's getting late. Arby's is going to close soon. Oh, this is not looking good. All their focus goes to food. They proceed then to interrupt Jesus and tell him that it's probably a good idea to dismiss the crowd so they can go and get food. Now, there's only one reason why they did this. If you think about it, there's only one reason. They must not have thought Jesus was aware. I mean, why else would they have interrupted him? If they knew that Jesus was aware of this and that he could take care of it, they would have had no reason to interrupt him. If they believed fully that he's aware and he's got it under control, they wouldn't have needed to interrupt him. But they interrupted him because they thought they needed to inform him that the people might be hungry. Let me ask you a question. When you pray to God, do you pray for God to help, or do you pray to inform God? Yeah, one of our many flaws. And we've all done this. Even if you don't realize you're doing it, the disciples should have known that Jesus was well aware of the physical needs of the crowd and that he could take care of it by himself. But instead, they interrupt his work to distract him with things that are not of the Spirit. This happens in so many churches today. God will be focusing on spiritual things, but people end up focusing on physical things. And they end up interrupting the spiritual so that emphasis can be put on the physical. And either churches do this because they don't think God's aware of the physical, or because people are just carnal and they don't like the things of the Spirit. It's too convicting. And Satan is always looking for ways to distract us from the spiritual. And he's doing it so much. I mean, we had a problem with the plumbing at the parsonage over there, and we had to get that dug up to be fixed. The water line to the church was leaking. We had to get that dug up to be fixed, and all that stuff costs money. And Satan is wanting so much for us to say, "Oh, look at all the stuff that needs to be done. Focus on that. Start worrying about that. Start complaining about that. Start being afraid of where the money's going to come from instead of focusing on all the lost people out there." That's what Satan wants to do so much right now, is just to get us to focus on everything physical and ignore the things that are spiritual. God is always aware of everything going on, and we must trust him that he will take care of things in his time. I love what he says in Luke 12:6. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, and not one of them is forgotten before God? Even the hairs of your head are numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. If Jesus cares about pennies and birds, surely he cares of what's happening in your life and all the things that you might need. And he's well aware, and he's already got a plan in place to take care of you if you're trusting in him. And what's worse is the disciples' solution to this problem is absolutely absurd. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. They want 5,000 to 10,000 people to go into the surrounding countryside late at night to all buy food at the same time. That is absolutely ridiculous. It's bad enough that they interrupted Jesus and did not trust that he knows all this already, they could have interrupted him and then said, okay, Jesus, we think this is a problem. You tell us what we can do about it. But instead, they tell Jesus what the problem is, and then they tell him what the solution is. They would rather use their stupid human solution than ask God, Jesus, what he wants to do. And this is why a lot of churches die today, because they interrupt the work of the Spirit to focus on non-spiritual things. And then they use their own disastrous ideas to focus on the non-spiritual things. I love Jesus' response to them. I love it, right? He gives them exactly what they're asking for. Verse 37, he answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? They interrupt what Jesus thinks is important to focus on what they think is important. So Jesus says, fine, you think this problem is important, then guess what? You fix it. If you think this is such a big deal and you need to take emphasis off of my teaching, then you're the one that's got to fix it too. That's what he's saying to them. If you interrupt the work of God to focus on what you want, do not expect God to lift a finger to help. Don't expect him to help. If you think what you want is more important than what he wants, he'll be like, fine, you take care of it, if you think that's so important. Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them? A denarius was about a day's wage. Shall we spend 200 days worth of money? I can see them. See, this is when Jesus said, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. They're like, who's got sandwiches? What? Seriously. I can just imagine them like, and looking in their pockets. Philip, what do you got? You got a 10? I got a 5. I don't know. Judas, how much we got? What? Where'd all of it go? Thought we had more than that. Must be the tariffs. I don't know. Anyway. Couldn't resist. Anyway. Where are we? Verse 38. But yeah, I think they get the point that Jesus is not really wanting them to. They probably didn't even have that much money anyway. So then he says to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. Now, in John's account of this story, it is the disciple Andrew who finds the boy that has the loaves and the fish. But it says barley loaves, which was a particularly poor, poor people had barley loaf. It was really low rated. It was, it wasn't like a nice sourdough or something. It was, not very good. But what this shows us is Jesus is never shorthanded, okay? Not only is he going to feed thousands of people with such a small amount of resources, but they aren't even good resources. And then verse 39, it says, then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before them. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. So not only was the bread low quality, but Jesus still used his disciples to pass out the food, even though they were the ones that interrupted him and did not have the right mindset. God is not limited by anything. It doesn't matter how little the resources are, and it doesn't matter how imperfect the people are. God does not require us to have everything all set before he's going to use us. And the one thing that I love is, the book of Hebrews tells us that God disciplines us as a father disciplines his children. But God's discipline, his correction is not, he doesn't do it by just scolding us and yelling at us and shaming us and rubbing our nose in it. Often the way that God corrects bad thinking is by inviting us into what he's doing so we see what he sees. And then our hearts change to get on board with what God is doing. That's what he's doing with the disciples. He's like, all right, here, come on. Let me show you what I'm doing so you can see once again who I am. Now, what can we learn from the crowd of people? So Jesus had them sit down in groups of 100 and groups of 50. Now remember, there's 5 to 10 or more thousand people. So, 5,000 people, you're looking at, each divided into a group of 100, carry the 7 to what is that, 50 groups? Yeah. Yeah, I graduated fourth in my class. Don't ask me how many people were in the class, but anyway, and groups of 50. So there's a lot of groups, right, that are all sitting down. Okay, and his disciples are passing out the food. Now, I think there were more than just the 12, because you remember there was the 12 apostles, but there were several times when Jesus had more people than just them. He had, I think there was more than just the apostles, but still, to feed that many people, this is a task. And when it comes to the distribution of food, there's two groups that we need to focus on, okay? Now, I don't know the exact identity of these groups, but it's just a fact that there's going to be a group who's going to get their food first, and there's going to be a group who's going to get it last. And I think about that. That's very interesting to think the differences, right? So here you got a group in the front maybe, and they see Jesus with the bread and the fish, and he's giving thanks, and everybody's promised food, right? Jesus is going to feed you. We promise, sit down, and he will bring you food. Everybody's given the same promise. But there's this one group who immediately gets the food, right? And they're probably just happy and praising God, like, wow, this guy's amazing. He promised us food, and then we got it right away. This is awesome, right? And then you have other people behind them. Maybe it's 5 minutes, and they get their food, and then somebody else is 10 minutes. And these people, but there's not long wait, and they're happy, they're eating, it's wonderful. But then you think of that last crowd in the back. And maybe, the time's going by and they're seeing people eating, but they don't have any food yet. And then more time goes by and they're getting hungrier. And they see even more people eating, but they just don't have food. And then they try to look up front and remember, Jesus just had a couple of loaves and some fish. It's not like a catering spread. So they look and all they see with Jesus is just this small amount of food. And they look at how many people are in front of them and they start to get discouraged, like, there's no way that's going to be enough food. We're not going to get any food. And they start comparing. Why does they get food first? Why did Jesus give it to them? Why didn't he give it to us first? Why are they getting it first? And then maybe bitterness sets in. And maybe resentment. And then doubt. And before you know it, maybe they totally forgot that they were even promised food at all. And they're just feeling hopeless and distraught. And this is so applicable to today. Because how often, you see, Jesus gives his children all the same promises. And you have some people, they pray and boom, right away, God does it. Whatever, they pray, boom, right away, God answers, God heals. And you're praying the same prayer and nothing's happening. And you're seeing everybody else get answers to prayer and you're like, wait, I'm praying the same, wait, is this promise for me? Yeah, this promise is for everybody, okay. Why isn't God answering me? Why isn't he doing it? And you start to see everybody else. And they're praising God. Evan, do we have any praises this morning? God came through and he answered me. And everybody's clapping, but you're sitting there like, he didn't give me anything. And the discouragement sets in. And then maybe some bitterness. And then Satan comes along and starts to say, you know what? That promise probably doesn't apply to you. And before you know it, you are destroyed and your faith is gone. And it's just resentment and bitterness and doubt. But what we know, it says at the end of this passage, everybody ate till they were full. Even that last group in the back, no matter how long it took, they got the same food as the group that got it first. And they were satisfied just as much as the group that got it first. No matter how God interacts with other people, you need to know if God has promised you something, he will fulfill that promise. It does not matter what the timing is. You do not try to understand the timing of God. It will drive you insane. Just know, whether you're the first group or the last group, if he has promised you something, he will do it when it needs to happen. And oftentimes, after the fact, you realize, wow, it was important that he didn't give it to me right away. A lot of times you see that it was his wisdom not giving it to you right away. And so as we close this morning, it's when you're in preaching class, it's interesting. You're kind of told, okay, you need to have a nice conclusion to your sermon, a very concise, clear-cut conclusion. And I find that harder and harder because there's a lot of points in this sermon. Ultimately, though, what the thing that needed to be the same with the disciples and the crowd was trusting in Jesus, that he knows what he's doing and he will do what he say he'll do. So no matter what the circumstances look like, that is irrelevant to what God has promised. Nothing is going to prevent Jesus from accomplishing what he said. No matter how bad something looks, it doesn't matter. God will do it. What isn't that a hymn? Little is much when God is in it. So let us not doubt anything that the Lord says to us, because nothing can stop him from doing it. So I believe.